Hello and very welcome to the fourth episode of my podcast in English. If you've already watched me and you are coming back, thank you so much. And if this is the first time, just let me introduce myself very briefly. I'm Annette Petavy. I'm a Swedish crochet and sometimes knit designer living in France, so I'm definitely not a native English speaker, as you will hear and as you have already heard up till now. I wanted to launch this podcast in English. I'm doing videos in French as well on another YouTube channel called Annette Petavy Design, and I wanted to broaden the scope and start doing videos in English as well. As I will discuss later in this podcast, I'm editing a monthly newsletter both in French and English. My blog is only in French, so it felt kind of nice to be able to have this channel to discuss crochet, yarn, sometimes knitting in English as well. So last time in episode number 3, I explained that I was going to shift my schedule a bit. Normally I try to record every week, once in French, 1 week in French, the other week in English. But of course, when I have a show coming up, things get really busy. And that was what happened. And I discussed this show in the last podcast because for this show, it was a small event that I organized with a few friends, and I was responsible for the yarn bombing. So at the end of the last episode, I showed you one of the panels that we had prepared from the more than 450 squares we had received for this yarn bombing event. I don't really have the time to edit the video a lot, so I cannot put pictures of the yarn bombing in here, but please check out the link here below to my blog post in French about yarn bombing. It's in French, but it's full of images, and you will be able to see how things looked and also how we worked on this beforehand. It was a great experience. It's only the second time that I was responsible for decorating an event in, let's say, yarn bombing style. I loved it because I really enjoy this collective perspective. I also really love the idea of putting very ordinary and sometimes not pretty things at all together to make something larger that you couldn't do by yourself, and something much more beautiful than the single parts. Also, it was a very fun experience to organize this event with my friends here in Lyon, in France. We had done it once before, 4 years ago, and I think 4 years is too much. It's too long between two events because basically you start over again. And if you have an idea for an event and you have 1 or 2 friends that you could rely upon to organize it with you, well, do it, because it's so much fun. It's lots of hard work, but so rewarding. An event can be a show, a retreat, a workshop, in perhaps a little longer workshop than usual. And it's just a fantastic experience. People often complain that there is not enough happening in their neck of the woods. Wow, why don't you make it happen? I really recommend it. More specifically, I think it's good to be just a small group of people at the core of the organization of the event. and hopefully you can rely on friends, partners, kids, etc. on the D-Day to help you make it happen, because that's always when you need just help to carry things, to install things, to buy things, to make sure it all works. But to plan, it's good to be a small group of friends and stay friends afterwards too. That's important. We did, definitely, both times. So I hope this will be I hope even my friends who spent more time than I in the organization will accept the idea to do this again, like in 2 years' time, perhaps. We'll see. So today, what I wanted to discuss with you is the topic of my current series in my monthly newsletter. So I edit a newsletter every month, or almost every month. There's a common newsletter for July and August, because with the summer vacation and everything, it's just not possible to make two. Well, my newsletters are not always organized as series. So in the newsletter, what you get is news. Huh? That's why it's called a newsletter. News about what I'm doing right now, patterns I've published, my own, patterns of other indie designers that I published on my website, and you also get a tutorial. So sometimes it's a one-off tutorial, something specific that I've come across and I want to show and share. And sometimes I organize it as a series. And that's very interesting, I think, because I get to delve into a topic and all its ramifications and applications. Well, I do not pretend to be completely into every part of the topic that's possible. But still, it's interesting because you can go further into one topic. For the readers, of course, if you're not interested in that topic, it's a pity. But there are few things that don't get interesting if you really take a hard look on them. So what I'm doing right now in my newsletter is a series about post stitches, or as they're sometimes called, raised stitches. So these are stitches that are not made in the top of the stitch, but around the stitch itself. And this part, this longer part of the stitch, is called the post. So that's why we call them post stitches. As usual, I use US terminology because I learned how to write patterns and instructions from working with US magazines, so hence the choice. So this series is ongoing. It started in May, where I only showed how to make front post and back post stitches. The example I used was the double crochet, which is very commonly used for this kind of patterns. But of course, the explanations are valid for higher stitches as well. It's very hard to make post stitches with shorter stitches than double crochet because, well, you need a post to work around. So with a single crochet, it's not very easy. I always try to start a series with these basic facts. Perhaps many readers know them already, but everyone doesn't. So it's to me it's important to start with the basics, also because then I can refer back to this newsletter, which is published as a blog post on my blog, even though you have to be a subscriber to be able to access it. And I can refer back to that in my patterns afterwards, which is quite interesting. So, post stitches, how to make them in May, and in June I showed a few stitch patterns using only post stitches. This could have been, yes, this is one. This is another swatch actually, but this looks very much like a post stitch rib. I also showed this one, which is a basket weave stitch. That's quite common too, just like the rib. Let's see if we can zoom in on that. Yes, no, no, no. Perhaps you can, it's clearer if I hold it here. And I also tried post stitches in a chevron stitch, which I found quite interesting. Please, no, no, my camera doesn't want to zoom in on this one. So here I've used only post stitches on both sides, both wrong and right side of the fabric, which means that this one, for example, just like this one, is completely reversible. So when you make a post stitch, you actually make a double layer of crochet because the stitches don't sit on top of each other, but they overlap vertically. This means that the fabric, if you use only post stitches, is very thick, very squishy. This is great if you make a pot holder, perhaps a bag, anything else that needs to be a bit thick to hold its shape. It's not great if you want something drapey or soft in the more fluid sense of the word. But it's very interesting, and you can also, of course, add some rows of post stitches into another work. If you have a look at there are lots of patterns right now that make use of post stitches as part of it. I'm just thinking about the Lost in Time shawl, where I think there are a couple of rows with post stitches that adds texture. And since the rest of the pattern is worked in normal crochet, it doesn't get this thick. So that was in June. So as I said, July and August, it's a single use newsletter, not to drive myself and my family totally crazy. And sorry, I started on the topic of crocheted cables, which is a common application of post stitches. Here, as you can see in this swatch, it's very narrow cables. I call them mini cables over just 2 stitches. But this was interesting because it allowed me to make some basic, show some basic tips and tricks that are very useful even when you work larger cables. So, sorry for that interruption. Something is tickling my throat and I didn't have a glass of water. But let's get back to the mini cables. So the mini cables, they're just cables because the stitches are crossed. But it's in some ways easier to make a mini cable than a larger cable. And at the same time, discussing mini cables made it possible for me to show some tips and tricks that are very useful even when you work larger cables. As you can see here, this is not a fabric made only of post stitches. On the back side, it's more or less flat. The cables are done against the backdrop of single crochet. So this is a much thinner fabric, and the layering of the stitches takes place only at the cables. And I think it's rather pretty. I mean, this is something that you could adapt and use in another design. Just throw in a mini cable somewhere, perhaps to underline a border or something. And so this past newsletter for September, I thought I'm going to discuss larger cables because there were a few things that are really useful only with larger cables. This is just a 4-stitch cable, so it's not very large, but this was just to show how it works. I think, yes, I'm holding it upside down. Well, it's quite reversible in this direction. And actually, when I was going to start on this newsletter, well, I would say I wasn't very inspired because I kind of tried to cram it in between lots of other things, and I hadn't really taken the time since I first started researching crochet cables to go back to the technique and revisit it. And it just felt like a chore, and I don't like that because crochet is not a chore to me, it's a passion. So what I did is that I said, okay, I'm going to take at least half a day off and just work post stitches. Just try, try of course to make a 4-stitch cable because that was what I was going to show in the newsletter and hadn't done one for a long time. But also play, and that's something I think is very important. So now I'm just going to show you a few results, a few swatches coming out of that play date with my hook and post stitches. And if you're subscribed to newsletter, you've seen them, but not up close, because I took a picture at the end of the newsletter to try to inspire you to try other things. I like crochet cables, but I think it's interesting also just to try to draw shapes with the post stitches on a solid background without trying to cross the stitches, because cables imply that you cross the stitches, and this makes for a thicker fabric. In my mind, these thicker fabrics are useful for some projects, but not for all. And experimenting with post stitches in other ways opens up a lot of new perspectives. So here it's just post stitches running over a background of single crochet without ever crossing, but still I think it makes for quite a clear pattern. Of course you can, I didn't block this very well, I think. Of course you can try anything in this according to this idea. Here I did another swatch with post stitches running over, and what I tried to do here was to get closer and closer to, yeah, almost mimicking a cable design, but you can see here that the post stitches on this line, they end a little bit abruptly, and here I've tried to make them grow more closely into one another. Let's see. Yes, now you can see it a bit more. Of course, this is no real stitch pattern, it's just me playing around, but I think some of this can have some potential. I also made a very simple swatch to see how this would work out in multicolored yarn. In my opinion, it's quite interesting because the shifts in color are slightly offset because of the structure of the stitch, and I think this is really something that I'm going to continue to work on. Other ideas are to think about what can we do with the background stitches. In solid single crochet, if we don't work flat like this swatch, the race stitches, the post stitches, will not be vertical, because if we work in the round, the top of the single crochet will always be offset in the same direction, so we will not be able to keep these columns of post stitches vertical. So how can I work on the background stitch to keep things straight even when working in the round? Is it possible to work on a background of double crochet with longer stitches? How would that look? Can we work on single crochet in the back loop only? How will that affect? That will affect the height of our rows. How will that affect the stitches we need to use here? This is definitely an opportunity to geek out completely on the topic of crochet and post stitches. So I think that was just about what I wanted to talk to you about. I think that was just about what I wanted to say today. So if you have any comments and suggestions about post stitches, please feel free to comment below the video. In the next installment of the newsletter, I'm going to see how I can combine post stitches with a more open background fabric, either by opening up the background, working in filet or something else, who knows, or by applying post stitches in an existing lace pattern, which is also very interesting because it brings texture and to something that is very light and airy, without making it too heavy, but at the same time, sometimes a thin crocheted fabric can benefit from having some weight added to it. So I'm going to continue experimenting with that. I hope that you will too. So as I said, if you want to subscribe to the newsletter, the link is down here below. There is chances are good that we'll see each other in 2 weeks' time, because there's no show planned before the end of October. So if you like, head on over to my website at annettepetavy.com or to my Ravelry group, Annette Petavy Design, and see what's happening over there. Until next time, bye-bye.